Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Using Data Visualization to Improve Messaging. Sorry, getting used to the advancement here. My name is Kiernan McGordy and I'm a Principal Program Evaluator at the North Carolina Program Evaluation Division. And I will be moderating our webinar today. I'd like to thank the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society and the National Conference of State Legislatures for sponsoring this webinar. NLPES is the NCSL Staff Association for legislative staff involved in program evaluation or performance auditing. One of its key purposes is to promoting professional development opportunities like this webinar for legislative staff. I serve as the chair of the NLPES Professional Development Subcommittee, so I'm particularly pleased that we could bring this program to you today. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. If you want a PDF of today's presentation right now, you can go to the icons on the top right and click on the one that looks like a piece of paper with a play arrow. We will take your questions after the presentation has been given, but feel free to enter your questions in the chat box at the lower left of your screen at any time. Our presenter today is Catherine Tyson, a Senior Program Evaluator at the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor. Catherine started working for the Legislative Auditor's Office in 2015. She holds a Master's of Public Health degree from Emory University. Catherine's passion for data visualization began after she attended a data visualization workshop by Stephanie Evergreen. Since then, she has developed and presented a data visualization training to OLA staff, and her training included a template that OLA staff can use to create certain visualizations. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Kiernan, for that introduction. I think we can all agree that we want our work to draw attention to issues, make an impact, and convince others to take action. Data visualization is one tool you can use to achieve these goals. Today I'll cover 4 topics. First, I'll explain why you should care about how your organization presents information visually. Second, I'll provide an introduction to charts or types of data visualizations and spend some time talking about certain types of charts. Third, we'll explore some key data visualization design concepts, and I'll walk through step-by-step how to apply these concepts to your charts. And finally, I'll briefly discuss some software programs available for creating data visualizations. So first, why should we visualize data? Data visualization is not new. In fact, it's been around for centuries, and you might recognize these visual diagrams. The graphic on the top right-hand side of the slide is Florence Nightingale's 1858 area graph that shows that epidemic disease in blue was responsible for more British deaths over the course of the Crimean War than battlefield wounds in red. And the bottom graphic is Charles Joseph Maynard's famous 1869 map that portrays the losses suffered by Napoleon's army during its invasion of Russia in 1812. As computer technology has advanced, so has the availability of software programs capable of building a wide array of data visualizations. Now everyone, including legislative staff like us, can easily create good data visualizations. We see data visualizations everywhere and every day, from news media to smartphone applications, scientific articles, sports broadcasts, utility bills, and so on. People are becoming used to seeing good visualization. It's now an expectation. The reason why we see these data visualizations every day is because research shows that depicting information visually speeds up our ability to understand and remember the information. An effective data visualization may look pretty, but our true goal is to support reader comprehension. Here's an example. This is an excerpt from a report my office published in March. This describes how an office within the Minnesota Department of Health has not met deadlines for completing maltreatment investigations as required by state law. Research suggests that our readers will have a difficult time remembering the specific and very important details in these paragraphs, because the information is presented only as text. However, coupling the text with data visualizations takes that message to a new level. Readers now have a greater likelihood to remember the important details. This is because visuals are particularly good at activating human pathways for memory formation. We can use this to our advantage by applying tried and true graphic design concepts to our visualizations. So let's learn about how we form memories and how graphic design elements enhance the process during the 3 stages of memory formation: pre-attention, working memory, and long-term memory. When something catches our eye, it automatically taps into the earliest stage of attention, or what some researchers call pre-attention. This stage of memory formation occurs without focused energy on the part of the viewer. Graphic designers operate in this stage. Emphasis techniques such as changes in color, motion, alignment, orientation, and size grab viewers' attention. Here's an example. In this graph, you might find yourself looking for something that stands out, such as peaks, valleys, intersections, dominant colors, or outliers. You might have noticed that green line that crosses through the others. However, when trying to understand the graph, you might have felt caught up at certain points. This graph, which displays the same data as the previous one, uses color to focus your attention. Compared with the previous graph, you probably didn't have to even read the data labels, the axis, or the title, and you're about 90% on the way to understanding the key message. Most likely you saw that decreasing blue line, checked the labels and the title, and you got the point. Site C is important. This graph is displaying a relatively simple concept, but sometimes you have to present very complex and detailed information to your audience. In these cases, intentionally thinking about how to capture your viewers' attention can help them send information they see. Next stage of memory formation, working memory. We use working memory to bridge the gap between pre-attention and long-term memory. Working memory is what we use when something has caught our eye and we decide to focus on it and think about it. Information must make it through this stage to be available for future recall. However, working memory is limited. Research has shown that we can only hold about 3 to 5 chunks of information in our working memory at a time. When a viewer's working memory is overloaded, it drops some chunks of information. By visually organizing and emphasizing information, effective data displays make this information more accessible for your readers and increase their ability to understand your message. For example, the map on the left on the slide is the current map of the Minneapolis Skyway system. It's notoriously confusing, possibly because readers are not able to use the diagram to convert the layout of the Skyway from their working memory to their long-term memory. The map on the right is a hypothetical Skyway system map created by a local reporter. It's modeled after the New York City subway system map. This upgraded map uses graphic design to pre-chunk information for viewers. It uses colored routes to guide users to their destination. While the map itself contains more than 3 to 5 chunks of information, a user traveling from U.S. Bank Stadium on the right-hand side of the map to 100 Washington Square on the top part of the map must only remember to walk along the purple route until they hit signs for a yellow route where they turn right. With the current map, the one on the left, users walking this same route must continuously orient themselves to more than the city streets and buildings. When information is received into the long-term memory, it can be recalled later on, retold to others, and combined with other ideas. We want the information we present to make it to this stage. When forming long-term memories, we rely on conventions and metaphors. In other words, our brains use our past experiences to develop expectations to create cognitive shortcuts. For example, we generally think of high performance as being spatially high in a chart, or low performance as being spatially low. And while visuals depicting data over time can show time in any spatial direction and remain technically accurate, we've been taught to think of time as moving from left to right across a page or screen. Anytime conventions like these are flouted, a reader can experience confusion and uncertainty, which will weaken your visualization's effectiveness. Here's an example. Without thinking about it, we access 4 conventions in our mind to help explain the meaning of this graph. First, we think that like colors mean like things. Second, color saturation indicates higher or lower values. Third, categories are arranged and plotted from one extreme to another. And fourth, that the segments of a pie chart sum to 100%. As you can see in this graph, none of those 4 conventions hold true. In the pie chart, like colors do not mean like things. Rather, dissimilar responses are grouped together. Second, the color saturation does not indicate higher or lower values. While the categories are plotted from the largest percentage to the smallest, the order of the categories does not make sense with this Likert type scale. Finally, if you've already summed the percentages in the graph, you know that the pieces of the pie do not sum to 100%. What at first glance looked like a well-constructed graph repeatedly disrupts our expectations. It forces us to think harder about what we're looking at, and it limits viewers' ability to accurately understand and remember the information being presented here. This is a better version of that chart. This chart supports the 4 conventions I spoke about in the previous slide. In this chart, like colors mean like things because the positive and negative response categories are grouped together with color. Also, the darker colors indicate more extreme categories, and categories are arranged and plotted from one extreme to another. Finally, the segments of the bar sum to 100%. I have spent some time today talking about how we see and understand information. I did so because understanding this is critical to designing effective data visualizations. If your charts don't make what's important stand out, if complex data don't coalesce into a few clear ideas, or if unconventional visual techniques confuse your readers, the credibility of your message is at stake. I'll come back to those concepts later on in this presentation, and we'll revisit these design concepts. But for now, let's change our focus to types of data visualization. First, let's take a look at 2 broad types of visualization. If the information you want to present focuses on ideas instead of statistics, you're probably going to want to use a conceptual visualization. 2 examples of conceptual graphics are organizational charts and flow charts, such as the 2 diagrams on the top half of the slide. I've also made timelines and other sorts of graphics to organize and convey important ideas in reports I've written. On the other hand, if you want to present a message that's based on numbers, you'll use a data-driven visualization. The visual you choose will depend on whether the data are qualitative or quantitative in nature. For example, if you want to show the frequency with which certain words are mentioned in an interview or in a news article, you could use a word cloud, which is shown on this slide. If you want to compare revenues and expenditures for one program over time, you'd probably choose to use something like a bar chart to display that data. The remainder of this presentation focuses on those quantitative, data-driven chart types. Frankly, there are quite a lot of charts of this type, more than the ever-popular column, bar, line, and pie charts. Each type of chart has different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to presenting data, and column, bar, line, and pie charts are not always appropriate or the best way to present data. But how do you decide on a chart type? Well, that depends on a few key questions. Who will see this? What do they want to understand? What do they need to understand? What idea do I want to convey? What could I show? What should I show? And how will I show it? You'd probably consider these questions informally while writing reports and making graphics. However, I think it's important to always keep in mind why you intend to visualize your data in the first place. During the rest of this presentation, you'll hear me say often that certain choices depend on your message. The answer to these questions can help you define the message you intend to convey. For example, are you trying to show policymakers that a tax credit has had little effect on the state's economy? If so, how can you tailor the graphic to communicate that message to this very specific audience? Your message drives which chart type you should use and which formatting choices you make. I have grouped quantitative data-driven chart types into 6 categories based on the questions we just discussed, my data visualization research, and common types of research questions my office deals with. Presentations of single number intend to show the single most important number. Visuals that compare data across items or over time fall into the comparison category. Benchmark charts show how the data compare to a standard or a range of standards. Some charts are particularly good at displaying results from common survey questions, and I've grouped these charts into a survey category. Charts in the proportion category show data that are parts of a whole. And finally, charts that show relationships are grouped into a relationship category. I'd like to note that this is only one grouping of charts and many more exist out there. Also, the categories on this slide overlap somewhat. For example, you could use charts from the comparison category to visualize survey data. Today, I'm going to talk about graphs in 3 of these categories. However, I've created an infographic cheat sheet that categorizes about 30 charts into the 6 categories on this screen. And if you'd like more information about this infographic, feel free to email me after the webinar. There are many charts that compare data either among categories or across time. I'm going to breeze through the 12 on the screen. In the top row, stacked bar charts, line graphs, and side-by-side charts are quite popular ways to compare data, and you're probably familiar with them. In the second row, small multiples are charts that combine multiple bar or line charts to compare multiple categories. This is probably my favorite type of chart because I found that small multiples are so versatile. Back-to-back charts and deviation bar charts share some similar features. These graphs compare data across the middle axis. You might have seen this back-to-back graph before as a population pyramid. The next graph, overlapping columns, is used to compare 2 categories when one is inherently part of the other. Slope graphs are similar to line graphs, but they plot data at only 2 points in time. As an example, this type of chart would be useful if you intend to display a metric regarding a program's performance during its first and last year of operation, and the years between don't matter as much to communicate your message. Dot plots and dumbbell dot plots are yet another way to compare data. These charts could be used in similar situations as that side-by-side chart on the top right corner of this slide. Dumbbell dot plots are particularly good at showing the difference between 2 data points, as the line that connects the 2 data points draws the eye to the separation between the points. Lollipop charts are an alternative to the standard bar graph. These charts focus the eye on the most important part of the chart, the data point. They are particularly useful for long lists of data because they give some visual relief or white space that would not be there if you had used a bar chart. And finally, Sankey diagrams are used to show the flow of data between nodes, and the width of the band depicts quantity. This diagram could be useful for displaying the flow of money from state funds through state agencies and onto grantees, for example. The next group of charts I'll talk about today is benchmark charts. For simple displays of whether a target has been met, you could use indicator dots. This type of visual works well in call-out boxes, summaries, or even in tables. Benchmark charts and combo charts share similar qualities. Benchmark charts are used to compare data against a standard that stays the same across categories or time, and combo charts are used to compare data against a standard that changes across categories or time. Bullet graphs, the 4th graph on this screen, are an interesting chart that probably have limited applications. This chart plots data, the dark gray bar, and a yellow target line against 2 or more ranges of performance. In this case, we can say that these 3 levels of performance depict poor, satisfactory, and good ranges of performance. Undoubtedly, many charts can effectively display data collected from surveys, particularly those charts in the comparison category I talked about earlier. However, here are 4 chart types that can help you display results from common types of survey questions. 100% stacked bar and diverging bar graphs are effective ways to present data from Likert scale survey questions. As you can see on the screen, the difference between these 2 types of charts is their alignment. The alignment for the diverging bar graph allows it to be particularly effective at showing the relative sizes of positive values on one side of the middle line and negative values on the other side. Data from ranking questions can sometimes be difficult to graph. If you're plotting results from one survey that had one ranking question, you could use a bar graph or a lollipop chart to show the results. But if you ask that same ranking question over a period of time through multiple surveys, you could use this ranking data chart to show how the rank of the categories changed over time. And finally, nested diagrams can help show another tricky and common type of survey data, branching data. For example, this diagram could effectively show that of 100 survey respondents, 70% said they liked chocolate ice cream, and of that group of people, 60% like to top their chocolate ice cream with chocolate syrup, and so forth. After choosing a type of chart that could best present the story you want to tell, your next step is formatting the chart, such as by adding labels to your data, coloring certain data points, or adjusting the range of your axes. For all the power of software programs to generate reasonably good-looking visualizations, they're not capable of making decisions about how to hone visual into one that can inform readers and convince them to take action. It's up to us to intervene with decisions and bring our key ideas to the forefront. Remember that good design serves a more important function than just simply looking pretty. It helps your reader access and understand ideas. In this section, I'm going to discuss a set of design concepts you and your team can use to guide how you format your charts for your report or presentation. Well-designed data visualizations have 4 things in common. They're structured, clear, simple, and refined. In the next slides, I'll further describe these 4 concepts and fix a cluttered chart to show you how to use these concepts to improve your charts. First, structure. Does your visualization look neat and clean or messy and muddled? Impressions of the relative orderliness of a chart comes from its structure. This means that all charts in your report have a consistent structure, that they align visual elements, and they limit readers' eye movements. I'll talk about these 3 concepts in the coming slides. I created this line graph in Excel and did very little formatting that was not generated by Excel's default settings. While this is an accurate chart, and it might help me and my team understand the data, it's formatted in a way that makes it difficult for an outside reader to parse out and understand the main idea. This chart needs to be formatted to fit its intended purpose, communicating a specific message in my report. Let's start modifying the structure of this chart so it fits that purpose. First, make sure all of the graphics throughout your report or presentation have a consistent structure. For example, in my office's reports, every formal exhibit, whether it's a table, a chart, or conceptual diagram, includes title, the visual, and a source line. Sticking to a consistent structure is useful for 2 reasons. First, it helps prevent ambiguity about the structure of the visualization itself because some key element, like a title, is missing. Second, consistently using these key elements makes visuals more reusable and shareable. Well-designed visuals have a balance between the title, visual, and source line. The visual should dominate the structure of the exhibit, and the other elements should serve that visual purpose. For example, the visual should take up about 3/4 of the allotted space, and the title about 20%, and the source line about 5%. Try to avoid giving the title too much emphasis, such as by having a large text size or a long title, as it will compete with the visual for the reader's attention. The second way to improve a chart structure is by aligning visual elements. Professional designers divide designs into evenly spaced grids of columns and rows. Aim to use as few points of alignment as possible, because more points make the chart feel busy. In this graph, center justification makes multiple alignment points for elements that could actually share one. Unaligned labels and other elements in this visual field create a sense of haphazardness. Now, I've left aligned the elements in the graph to give it a more clean structure. The third element of having good structure is limiting readers' eye movements. This graph forces readers to move their eyes back and forth from the data to the legend, back to the data, to understand which label applies to each line. It's best to put elements that work together in close proximity. Try to connect keys and legends directly to their visual counterparts. In this graph, I embedded the legend by putting labels next to the line it represents. I did this by simply adding text boxes. This is a relatively simple approach to limiting readers' eye movements, and you can do the same type of thing, embedding legends into all types of charts, including bar charts. Now, on to our second design concept, clarity. Does the chart make sense to you, or are you stuck wondering what you're supposed to see? Everything that makes a visual self-explanatory makes it more effective. This means that the chart is unambiguous and does not flout metaphors or conventions. The bottom line is that the less you have to explain the chart, the more you can talk about its ideas. Ambiguous visuals leave the reader without a key takeaway, and they're left on their own to try to assign meaning to the visual. They're forced to slow down and think about the visual instead of the message. In this chart, for example, I find myself asking, what does this mean? What is this chart telling me? The message is not clear. The visual shows the percentage of Americans who responded that they worry a great deal about certain issues over the past 15 years. However, the title and the subtitle only refer to the most recent year of data, 2018. Let's say for this exercise that we're interested in the trend over time and not the most recent year of data. As a result, we'll need to modify that title. Here's the chart with the modified title. Basically, I rephrased the subtitle so that it reflects our main message, that Americans have been concerned about the affordability of health care over the past 15 years. In addition to making sure your visuals are unambiguous, make sure that your visual does not flout metaphors or conventions. Basically, use color and other chart elements in a way that supports your audience's past experiences seeing and understanding visuals. And I talked a little about that earlier in this presentation. In our example, the chart is okay. The time runs from left to right on the x-axis, and the colors that are used in the chart itself are not ideal yet, but they support that each line represents a different category of data. On to our third design concept, simplicity. Does this chart look simple, elegant, and pleasing, or does it look cluttered, busy, and complex? Clarity and simplicity go hand in hand, but while clarity concerns effective communication, such as answering the question, does the idea come through? Simplicity addresses effective presentation, such as, are you only showing what's necessary for the idea to come through? When we think of simplicity, we often think of the absence of things, that if we just keep taking away more and more information, we'll achieve simplicity. But excessive simplicity leads to a lack of clarity. Instead, think about relative simplicity, how little you can show and still convey your idea clearly. Start by assessing each element in the graph. You can use the flowchart on the screen to help make these decisions. It first asks whether the element is necessary and unique. If it is, then consider whether the element can be made simpler. Another aspect of simplicity is the restrained use of color, and we'll discuss that more in a bit. Let's evaluate whether each element in this chart is necessary, or whether we can modify and delete elements to increase simplicity. I'll start at the top of the chart and work clockwise around the visual. Using the flowchart we just talked about, consider whether the title is necessary. It usually is, but is this one unique? No. In fact, the subtitle and the axis label, y-axis label, repeat parts of the title. And that y-axis label only describes the structure of the visual, not the message of the visual. All three elements can either be deleted or simplified. I rephrased the title and deleted the subtitle and y-axis label. My new title answers the question, what am I trying to say or show? This type of title is called an active title. My office uses active titles for our exhibits because it takes less time for readers to understand information if you just simply tell them the point directly. Also, it removes some concerns about ambiguity and lessens readers' risk of a misunderstanding. Now, let's look at the legend. Is that element necessary? Yes. It labels the data in the visual. Without it, you wouldn't know what the data are, what the lines represent, so we're going to keep the legend. Next, the axes, the X and the Y axes, are also necessary elements, and they usually are for data plots, so we're going to keep them. The Y-axis label, on the other hand, is not necessary for this chart. In this case, I think it's reasonable that my audience will understand that these numbers on the X-axis represent a year. So I'll delete that label in the next version of this chart. Finally, is the information in the visual itself necessary? Yes. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a visual. However, this chart contains a lot of extraneous and redundant elements. For example, there are tick marks along the X-axis, a label for each year, and a marker at each line to represent each point in time. Are these elements necessary? Well, the answer is a little more complicated than the other elements we just described. In this case, the necessity of these elements depends on the context of the presentation. So let's say this chart is going to be used in a formal PowerPoint presentation. That means the audience only has a few seconds to look at the graph and understand the message. The current graph, the one you see on the screen, does not support this purpose. While the detail in the graph might blend well to discussing research findings as a small group or in a detailed appendix of a report where readers could take time to contemplate the other data points, we don't want to muddy the main message for the audience, the people who are listening to the PowerPoint presentation. Let's simplify the visual by removing extraneous lines and redundant elements. Only the first and last year were necessary to understand the message of the graph, so I removed the X-axis labels for all years between 2004 and 2018, as well as the tick marks on the X-axis line. I also removed the Y-axis line, recolored the grid lines to gray, removed the markers from each line. And I'll show you that change again. In this graph, that Y-axis line is simply unnecessary for readers to understand this graph, so I deleted it. As you can see, these black horizontal grid lines compete with the lines in the graph, the data, so coloring the grid lines gray lets them recede behind the important visual information, the data. Additionally, the markers along the lines are no longer necessary once I remove the years from the X-axis, which was the information the markers were displaying. The other thing I changed was the color of the lines. To simplify the graph and to emphasize the one key message of this graph, I colored all lines except for the one for affordability of healthcare gray. I did this because simplicity suffers when you make charts too colorful because you want them to be eye-catching or you want you have a lot of categories to plot. In an effort to understand the chart, viewers will note color differences and wonder what they mean. The more differences they see, the more they have to work to figure out what the distinctions represent. Find the lowest number of distinctions you can use that preserves those that are needed to convey the message. Remember, gray is your friend. We typically think of gray information as background or secondary by comparison with the information color. Use gray to provide context without disrupting the main idea. Another thing to think about when applying color to your graphics is whether your color choices follow conventions. For example, use oranges and reds to represent negative values and blues and greens to represent positive values. Use contrasting colors for contrasting data and complementary colors for complementary data. If you have groups of data, use a similar palette of colors. And if you have a range of data, use low saturation colors or pale colors for lower values and high saturation or bright colors for higher values. Last year, I developed a color guide for my office to use when applying color to our graphics. The guide contains color codes for several different types of color schemes that fit the conventions I just mentioned. Feel free to email me after this webinar if you'd like more information about our color guide. Now we have addressed structure, clarity, and simplicity. And frankly, our chart looks pretty good, and I could use it as is. While I won't today, I could take steps to further refine the chart. An important way to refine your chart is by focusing on the main idea. The preceding steps likely will have helped you clarify the main idea you intend to convey. Sometimes, though, you might struggle to pull out a key message. The most aggressive way to make the main idea stand out is by adjusting reference points, or the data and information that complement or contrast with the main point. You can add, move, or shift them. The charts on this slide provide an example of adjusting reference points using some completely made-up data. The message in this chart on the left is slightly muddled by the abundance of data. In the chart on the right, I've removed reference points, which makes the message pop. Specifically, I removed the middle age groups because they didn't help illustrate the idea of an age divide. Another way to refine your message to make it stand out by emphasizing or isolating it. Just as we emphasize text using bold-faced font, underline, or highlighting, we can use a variety of techniques to emphasize key information in a visual. Color is a common form of emphasis, and you just saw how I used color in our affordability of healthcare chart to emphasize the one line of data we really cared about. Another way to emphasize parts of a visual is by adding demarcations such as trend lines. You can also choose to add annotations to a chart or try to de-emphasize other aspects of the visual to help make the main idea stand out. Here's a comparison of that healthcare affordability chart. Before and after, we used graphic design concepts to guide how we formatted this chart. You can apply these concepts to your visuals to improve their communication power. It will take some time to become confident in your application of these concepts. Personally, I've completed 2 reports in the 2 years after learning how to use these design concepts. And comparing my sets of visuals from the 2 projects I think is eye-opening. And I think you too will improve with time and practice. If you have questions about the graphics you make, I'd encourage you to show somebody in your office who's unfamiliar with the topic. Have them give you an immediate reaction, like within 30 seconds, and ask them what they understand from the graphic. Before we move on to the final portion of my presentation, let's talk about some important things to keep in mind when designing data visualizations. Remember that readers may print or copy your reports in black and white. While you cannot control whether this happens, you can take steps to make sure your graphics are legible in both color and in black and white. First, you can embed your legend within the graph, as we spoke about earlier. Second, test every graphic's ability by photocopying it in black and white. And third, be intentional about how and where you apply color. You should only use color to enhance or support the key message of the graph, and don't place dark shades or light shades right up next to each other. Those three strategies can help all readers interpret data visualization. However, make sure to test the colors you use for legibility for individuals with color blindness. There are many computer programs and websites that can help you determine whether a graphic is colorblind friendly. Additionally, as I'm certain you already do, take care to make sure your graphics are appropriately tagged for use with screen readers and other devices. Finally, there are some instances when visualizations do more bad than good. Obviously, don't create misleading or inaccurate charts. There are other times when it may be better to present data in a table rather than in a chart. For example, if you suspect that the audience will not understand how to read the graph, you may not want to visualize the data. And if the audience makes a judgment call about the visualization based solely on the data labels and not on the visualization itself, the table could suffice. There are other times when it's important to present data that are not on the same scale. In those cases, it's probably best to present the data in a table. And finally, keep in mind the power of visuals. Include in written reports only the visuals that convey your most important messages. Too many visuals can fatigue a reader and lead to confusing breaks in your report text. Finally, let's talk about some software programs you can use to create a visualization. I'll give you a brief overview of the pros and cons of 3 programs, as well as some other additional resources that can help guide your future chart-making endeavors. Tableau is a popular software program that was built for data visualization. Because it's popular, there are a lot of online resources to help make certain types of charts. However, your agency might not already have this program available for you to use. Microsoft Excel, on the other hand, is probably readily available to you. While this program was not built especially for data visualization, the program has several default chart types that you can use to easily plot your data. If you're skilled at chart making in Excel, there are many ways you can hack the program to produce uncommon charts. For example, you can use a scatter plot and some ingenuity to create any type of dot plot you want. Last year, I created what I call the chart start template for my colleagues to use to make these more complicated charts. Again, email me after this webinar if you would like to learn more about this template. Finally, you can use Microsoft Visio to create conceptual diagrams. In the past, you may have created these types of graphics using PowerPoint. However, in my opinion, Visio has some features that allow for more easily and neatly constructed diagrams. So if you're making those diagrams, I'd recommend checking out Visio. Regardless of the software programs you use to create visuals, it's helpful to have guides and examples of well-made charts. There are many great textbooks and data visualization out there. But of the textbooks I've read, I'd recommend starting with the 3 on the screen, as I think they're well written and provide many useful examples. Additionally, there are a lot of websites and blogs that present mix of bad graphs, instructions on how to make new types of chart, other interesting ideas about reporting data. I recommend signing up for email alerts from websites and blogs you like so that you can see new information as it's posted. I listed my 3 favorite blogs on this site. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Feel free to email me with any questions or for more information about the materials I mentioned earlier in this presentation. Now, I believe we'll move on to questions.
Thank you, Catherine, for your excellent presentation. We have a few minutes for questions, so if you could type them in the chat box at the lower left of your screen, I will ask Catherine to address as many as we can get to. I'll start, Catherine, with the first one we have about citing the source should you include the year? I'm thinking that's if you've also put the year somewhere in the title such that it would be repetitive.
Sure, and I think there's several ways you could cite a source. I'm thinking about some of the reports we do. If something has a year that's easily recorded, then that would be good. Sometimes I've seen reports where people have like a sources cited at the end that would have more information about sources. You might have noticed on the chart that I modified throughout this presentation, I had a really simple source listed there. That's because I took data from 15 different surveys to make that chart, and I thought it would overwhelm the visual if I had included all of those sources in there. But if that was included in a report, I'd probably have a sources cited page.
So our next question is, you said your favorite was small multiples, and like the viewer, I wasn't sure what you meant by that. Could you talk a little more about them?
Yeah. Like I said before, the small multiples are a really versatile type of chart. You can use them with bar charts or line charts to compare multiple things. So, for example, in a report that my office published in March, the same one that I showed you the excerpt from earlier in the presentation, we use small multiples line charts in that report to present data over time about whether this office had met deadlines for completing and starting their investigations. And we use those charts side by side. So, for example, this office has to meet many different deadlines. So there's a 2-day deadline, a 10-day deadline, and a 60-day deadline. And we wanted to compare all in the same graph those deadlines. But they had different underlying data, and they each were unique graphs. So they are literally 3 separate graphs stacked up next to each other with the same y-axis and the same x-axis but repeated.
Okay. Someone asked if you could tell us what you said about visually impaired, colors for the visually impaired, maybe how you know, what's your source to go to know you're not violating that.
Yeah, like I said, there are several computer programs and websites out there that you can use to help see what that exhibit or what chart would look like to people with color blindness. So, for example, I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but I think it's like Colorblind Viewer or something. I would suggest Googling it, Googling color blindness program, and basically it has upload a copy of the exhibit as a JPEG or a picture form, and then you can toggle through different types of color blindness, and it will overlay a filter so you can see what it looks like for individuals with color blindness.
So the next question, you had mentioned you created a chart of colors for your office. How do you determine what colors to use? Do you just need to have someone on staff who's got a good eye?
Well, that's a great question. I think, well, there are definitely a lot of resources out there to help you think about which colors look good in certain situations. And basically the process to develop that guide was some discussion with leadership in the office about what the main color of our reports was going to be, and we decided on like a dark navy blue. And at that point, then I used a Adobe product, it's called Adobe Color, to plug in the code for that dark navy blue color, and I was able to find colors that worked, that were complementary to that color, and then continued building palettes off of the colors that I was finding using this program. So we have many different palettes, I think 6 or 7. One that's a complementary color palette, that's blues and purples and greens that you can use when you're presenting categories of data. And then there's a diverging color palette that has blues and oranges, and those you use For example, if you're presenting Likert scale questions with, or survey questions that have, positive values and some negative values, so you'd assign blue and the shades of blue to the positives and shades of orange to the negatives. If you have more questions, I'd be willing to answer them over email or over phone, or even send you a copy of that color guide.
Oh, great. The next question is about font types. Do you have preferred font types for data visualization?
Yeah, well, that's a great question as well. There's a lot of research out there about typology, which is the study of fonts. Again, I would point you to those resources that I had at the end of the presentation. But generally, and what my office has decided on, in charts you kind of have a smaller area to put a lot of information. And so a good font for that would be something like Arial Narrow, which is a condensed font. In the rest of our report, in the text, we use Times New Roman, and our headers are Arial. So we have some consistency throughout the reports about which types of fonts we use, but in charts we use Arial Narrow.
And I'm just going to add a follow-up. Is there some magic, like don't use more than 3 types of fonts?
Well, I think there are a lot of opinions about that. What I have read is that using a different font for headings and a different font for the text of the report is a good practice because it helps cue your readers into noticing changes between headings and text. And then adding that third type of font onto our exhibits was kind of a decision to, again, separate that exhibit from the rest of the text, as well as have a little bit more room to include information.
So the next question is about the comparison charts you showed. Are all of them available in Excel if you can, hack it enough?
Yeah, all except for that last one on the bottom right. So that means, the stacked bar.
Was that the nesting one?
It was the Sankey one. That one, there might be a plugin somewhere online to create that in Excel, but when I've made them, again, I've used like a free online software program. But things like the lollipop graphs, or there's dot plots and the dumbbell dot plots, those are all hackable using Excel. And those graphs that I just mentioned, those are actually scatter plots that I've manipulated it to show those unique graph types.
And I think we've answered our last question already with, is it Adobe Color that you use to help you develop the palette?
Yeah, that was one of about 3 websites that I used all in conjunction. The Adobe Color helped me kind of examine colors and see what was compatible with our main color. I also used 2 other programs. Again, I'm not thinking of them off the top of my head. I think one is called Color Brewer 2, which is a program developed for cartographers for finding color schemes that work well and that are colorblind friendly. So Color Brewer 2 would be a good place to look for some inspiration. And then I also used a third program that helped me develop shades of colors, but again, I'm blanking on the website name right now. But if you email me afterwards, I can send you the link.
All right. Well, seeing that we've gotten through all our questions and we're 1 minute shy of ending here, I just wanted to thank Catherine again for that fabulous presentation, and thanks to all of you out there for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the NCSL website in the next few weeks. The webinar is now concluded.